Sound of Freedom was one of the largest, if not the largest, grossing independent films in American history. Now, the man whose story was told in that movie, in a terrific portrayal by actor Jim Caviezel, is under fire as at least 10 women are accusing him of sexual assault. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, honestly, this is a painful story for me to tell because I went to see with my wife the movie Sound of Freedom. I think we encouraged other people to go to see it. Jim Caviezel put on a great performance. It was a stunningly successful movie, largely not because it was some big Hollywood blockbuster, but largely because of the topic, which was child sex trafficking. And Tim Ballard, who was the focus of this story, the real-life anti-trafficking hero, was the guy who would go in there to rescue these children in what was called Operation Underground Railroad. Last year, Ballard stepped down from his position. The New York Times says there are some 6 litigations underway right now accusing him of sexual encounters that are inappropriate, of ranging from harassment to assault. And it's the challenging part for me is child sex trafficking is a real thing. But Stephen Green, stories like this give efforts to raise money to fight it a black eye. And our friend Glenn Beck was a big booster of this movie, and many others have had to back away from Tim Ballard now as the news comes out about these alleged encounters with women. Steve, there seem to be 2 aspects to this story. Number one, that Ballard is accused of having engaged in play acting as part of his role of going undercover to try to bust up these rings, and having women work with him who were pretending to be prostitutes or pretending to be girlfriends or whatever, but he would push them beyond pretend. In other words, he continued the so-called play acting when they were alone in private, and he would have them engage in activity that they were not expecting to and they did not want to. And so there was sexual activity going on there. The second, and I think, Steve, in a way, is more concerning, is that when Operation Underground Railroad found pimps, essentially, who were trafficking child sex slaves and bought their freedom from the pimps, what happened in reality was the pimps went out and found children to sell to Operation Underground Railroad. And so you've got cases in court here involving sexual assault from women, but you also have allegations here that it may be that very few, if any, real child sex slave victims who had already been in that situation were rescued, but rather he created a market for selling children to his organization. Steve, I guess in a larger sense, since we don't know how this is going to go in court, and these are obviously allegations, the larger question is, how do you deal with daily situations where your heart breaks for some challenge or hardship that somebody's undergoing? You want to help, you give money, or you support some sort of effort, only to find out that all 2 human beings are running the organization.
Well, we all are human beings. We all have our own flaws and faults. You try and find the best you can, and hope and pray for the best. Without sounding too cold, there's something I always think of in these circumstances, and I wish I could remember which economist said this, because it's something I've come to live by, and I'd like to be able to give proper credit. But the saying goes something like, show me a man's incentives, and I'll tell you how he behaves. And if what this program did, I wasn't aware they were actually essentially buying kids off of the trafficking market. But if the incentive is a very large cash bonus for showing up with this kid, this supposedly, I guess, trafficked kid, you've now created a market to basically kidnap kids who weren't necessarily in a traffic situation to sell them to this well-meaning person. And that's a horrible thing. It's almost a case of vigilantism, which never works out well in a law and order society, I guess. there are matters where it has to be the law, and it can't be a private individual or a private organization, because the law is not going to do that kind of thing. Our laws are imperfect enough as they are, and certainly our enforcement of them is. That said, this is a very real problem, and I don't want the problem to get buried by a bad messenger, if that is indeed the case here. We have an estimated 320,000 kids, illegal alien kids, who our federal government has simply lost track of over the last 3 or 4 years. We allowed them in, they're separated from their parents, they're believed to be trafficked, and we just don't know because the Biden-Harris administration doesn't want to know. That raises uncomfortable issues for them and their policies. 320,000 kids is an embarrassment that they're trying to sweep under the rug. And this might be, I think, maybe the most heartbreaking part of this story, Scott, is if these allegations are true, and frankly, even if they aren't true, the good work that they at least tried to get done is going to get swept under the rug along with those 320,000 kids that the Biden-Harris administration lost.
Bill Whittle, Tim Ballard was somewhat of a hero in conservative circles, not only because of the movie, but obviously, as I mentioned, Glenn Beck was a big cheerleader for him. I mean, Beck, I think at one point went as far as to tell his listeners that you're contributing to this effort may be the reason for which you were called to serve. Like he made it was very intense for him. The church that Beck is part of, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were big supporters and boosters of his efforts. They have since said that Ballard engaged in morally unacceptable behavior. They've backed away from him. He spoke at Turning Point Action. He spoke at CPAC. He sat down with then President Donald Trump to discuss border security and other issues involving trafficking and child safety and things like that. Bill, I don't know how you draw a line between just being critical and skeptical about everything and shutting yourself off from any effort to help, and being so gullible that anybody who holds their hand out and tells a good story gets your contribution. How do you navigate these things? And what should, frankly, a lot of these conservative organizations and people do now that it appears that Ballard has burned everybody in a lifestyle that nobody thought he was involved in?
Yeah.
This is a really, really useful test case to see how morality works. To sometimes you'll run into a situation where it's a great example to see how critical thinking works. This is maybe a great example to see how critical feeling works. So let's unpack some of this stuff just bit by bit. I'm not advocating. I don't have a horse in this race. I'm not trying to defend somebody. I'm not trying to prosecute somebody. So let's just look at some of the layers here and go through them one by one. Has he denied these allegations?
Yeah, he has. And he said he's basically saying that the play acting was now he didn't. The story doesn't deal with the allegations that essentially he created a market for these children, but he's basically saying that he didn't do what he did, what the women say he did, and that they're trying to milk him for millions of dollars by suing him. So
that's all I needed to know. So we start with the basic foundational ideas of this country, and that is the presumption of innocence. He has not been convicted of any crimes. I'm not saying he didn't do it, but I am saying that, and I would be making this argument if it were Joy Behar. There is the presumption of innocence in this country. And if this man reached a level of prominence, especially as a prominent conservative who was out there doing what I think most people would consider to be universal good, stopping child sex slave trade, there is certainly a sector of the population that is motivated to bring a guy like that down. So the first thing we have to do is we have to go to the presumption of innocence and understand that these are allegations. So before we throw this guy off the bus, let's see if he's convicted in a court of law by a jury of his peers. So I think that's the first thing we need to say. The second thing I think that is striking is if I don't know anything about the details of this case. But from what you've said in your setup of it, the most serious allegations concern him with these continuing the role playing on beyond the means of.
And these are sexual assault claims, some of which are lawsuits, others which are pending criminal investigation.
So the second thing that we have to look at here is, was there actual physical coercion on his part? Because if it turns out that he's got a relationship with this woman and this woman is not interested in any kind of a personal relationship with him, she is agreeing to do this in order to help stop this child sex slave trade. He then oversteps the boundaries. Is he using coercion on her, or could she have simply walked away from this and simply said, "This is inappropriate. I'm not willing to be a part of it." The reason I bring this up is not to blame the victims who are making the accusations against this gentleman, but I am saying that there's a large difference between a child who is in the sex trade whirlpool, who has no agency or authority whatsoever, versus a grown adult who could find herself the victim of inappropriate behavior and can immediately vacate the premises and call the police if it's a case like this. So again, I'm not trying to excuse the guy's behavior, but we start off by saying we don't know that he actually did these things. So ultimately, when it's all said and done, you can work through all sorts of different layers on this. But I think when you get right down to it, you get down to this fundamental issue. Do the good works that a person does in their life, are the actual works negated by the personal foibles of the person themselves? In other words, if you have let's say you have a rock and roll star who's produced incredible music over the course of decades, and you find out that this person has done some things that you find to be unsavory, does that undo the work? I don't think it does undo the work. And I think that this idea of destroying a person's work as a result of whatever character flaws they may have, up to and including criminal violations of character flaws that if proven guilty should land them in jail. The ultimate responsibility here is this. This man stepped in. I think this is one thing we can all agree on. This man stepped in to solve a problem that it was not his business to solve. This is the job of governments. This is why we have a government. If there are hundreds of thousands of children that are being used as sex slaves in the United States of America, this is not his problem to solve. He went in and tried to solve it anyway. And he apparently did some good with this. This business about creating a market, he didn't create a market. It's not like there was no child sex slave market until this guy started this operation of his, and then all of a sudden they started doing this. Steve's pointed out that there's hundreds of thousands of children that are victimized by this right now. After he called attention to it, it's still going on. So when you take all of this stuff on balance, Scott, I'm not St. Peter, and I'm glad I'm not. I'm a human being just like everybody else. But if this guy to find himself in front of the pearly gates and you put what he accomplished in terms of good versus what he accomplished in terms of evil, I don't see anything in these allegations that balance the two. What I do think we're seeing is we are living in a world now where the taint of misbehavior has become so overpowering that people will abandon a person who's done fundamental good because the social proof, the social pressure. So you're supporting a guy who basically victimizes women. No, I was supporting a guy who was trying to stop the child sex slave trade is what I was doing. And so all of this stuff is a big bloody mess, and I think that's probably the ultimate lesson of all of this. Really, the final, ultimate, last message is life is a big bloody mess. Nothing is black and white. Nothing is simple. Nothing is good and evil. Nothing is this. But to say that because everything is a shade of gray means that we should have absolutely no opinion on right and wrong is the trap that we fall into here. Absolute good and absolute evil are moral objectives. And none of us are absolutely good, and none of us are absolutely evil. All we can try to do is be the best people we can. And if you've accomplished a great deal of good in your life and you've had a number of personal foibles that have tarnished that reputation, I don't think it's fair to erase the accomplishments, because the accomplishments are real.
And I'm with Steve and Bill. I think our justice system should work the way it's supposed to work, in that these are accusations against Tim Ballard. They may turn out to be true or false or varying levels of true. And he may face judgment or punishment of some sort, or he may be exonerated, although he would then repeat the line of the famous line that, where do I go to get my reputation back, if it turns out that he's innocent. The challenge here is that the accusations, the nature of these accusations, are not that somebody did good work and had character flaws. The challenge here is that it was the character in the work. And so it wasn't like a guy was up running a charitable organization and then is accused of, cheating on his wife. This was a guy who is accused of running a charitable organization where he would recruit women into it and use them in the work. And so that makes it more disturbing if it turns out that this is true. But the reason why I brought this story forward is I don't know Tim Ballard. And again, I loved the movie and I was very moved by it. And I couldn't remember. I asked my wife, but I couldn't remember. But it's possible I even made a small financial contribution to the organization at that time. I don't recall whether or not I did that. So the issue should not die no matter what happens with the court case. However, I do think it calls for an extraordinary level of discernment among people who are starved of the kind of information they need in order to exercise that discernment. And I think despite the fact that people you trust may be endorsing something, or organizations you trust may be endorsing something, or somebody says, oh, he used to be a Homeland Security agent, therefore we can trust, or an issue that's really close to your heart and that means a lot to you, we have a tendency in the human brain tends to see what it wants to see in order to reinforce pre-existing notions. And sometimes we need to have the power to dial that back and go, okay, what kind of due diligence could I do here? What kind of structure does this organization have? I remember once a friend of mine was interviewing for a position with an organization who existed entirely to do good. And I had a moment alone with the CEO of this organization away from my friend. And I said, who in this organization can say no to you? And he said, what do you mean? I said, if you want to do something, who in this organization can stop you from doing it? And he kind of waffled the answer, but my concern was that he had been very successful in what he was doing, and he had a lot of people around him telling him how great he was, and a lot of public plaudits and results that appeared in a public way. How do we know how do we know whether this guy can withstand the temptations of these kinds of situations? So I would just say that it made me realize that whatever organization you're part of, A, you've got to realize it's made up of human beings. B, you've got to make sure that you're not blinded by the light of somebody's brilliance or by your joy in their mission so much that you don't ask the appropriate questions, without being a jerk about it necessarily, but to do your due diligence and say, okay, what kind of checks and balances are in place here? Who can say no to this person? What would happen if this person were doing something wrong? How would that ever get caught? And in this case, they didn't say this in the story, but it appears as if this guy got caught because this movie was so successful. And the women who saw this movie said, wait a minute, there's another side of this story. We will continue to watch this story and bring you updates as events warrant, but it's a good cautionary tale. And I would say this, don't use skepticism about things like this to say, I won't give, I won't help, I won't serve, I don't trust anybody. But as Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.